The most frightening part of addiction is not that the brain wants pleasure. It's that the brain can keep wanting something long after the pleasure is gone. This is why someone can understand the damage, hate the consequences, feel less pleasure than they used to, and still move toward the thing destroying them. The craving arrives before the argument, then the mind builds the argument around the craving. 200 years before dopamine research, Arthur Schopenhauer described this structure with disturbing precision. Desire does not ask reason for permission. It recruits reason after the decision has already been made. Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan spent years studying what dopamine actually does in the brain. His findings overturned what most scientists believed. The standard assumption was that dopamine was the pleasure chemical. When you experience something rewarding, dopamine releases, you feel good, you want to do it again. The reward and the wanting were assumed to be the same system. They aren't. Berridge's research established that dopamine is not the pleasure system. Dopamine is the wanting system. It drives the pursuit of reward, not the experience of it. He documented this with a series of experiments in which the dopamine systems of rats were selectively disabled. The rats, without dopamine, could still experience pleasure. When food was placed in their mouths, they showed the same positive facial expressions as before. They could taste, they could enjoy, but they wouldn't pursue. They lacked wanting without losing liking. The inverse was equally precise. Rats with artificially activated dopamine systems pursued rewards relentlessly, sometimes to exhaustion, without signs of proportionate pleasure. They worked for the reward compulsively. When they received it, the hedonic response was unremarkable. The drive to pursue and the experience of receiving had been decoupled at the neurological level. Wanting and liking are separate systems. Dopamine drives wanting. This is the finding that makes addiction neurologically coherent in a way the pleasure model never could. The person with addiction doesn't necessarily like the substance the way they did initially. Tolerance develops. The experience becomes less pleasurable over time. Long-time users frequently describe the high as less enjoyable than they remember, and less enjoyable than they anticipate. But the wanting doesn't diminish. In many cases, it intensifies. The dopamine system, sensitized by repeated exposure, rewired to treat the substance as the primary target of the wanting system, keeps generating craving independent of whether the experience delivers. The anticipation drives behavior that the actual experience no longer justifies. You can be fully aware that the thing no longer gives what it once gave. The wanting doesn't care. This is the part that breaks the pleasure model entirely. If addiction were about pleasure, about liking something too much, then the natural progression would be toward disengagement as tolerance reduced the reward. The experience delivers less. The person wants it less. The behavior extinguishes. That is not what happens. What happens is the opposite. As tolerance develops and the experience delivers less pleasure, the wanting often becomes more urgent, not less. The gap between anticipation and experience widens. The craving intensifies. The behavior accelerates toward something that is delivering diminishing returns at the experiential level, while the motivational system treats it as increasingly central. The wanting system doesn't update based on the quality of the experience. It updates based on the history of association. The substance has been deeply embedded in the brain's reward circuitry as a high-priority target. That embedding doesn't dissolve when the pleasure fades. It persists, and it keeps generating pursuit independent of what the pursuit actually delivers. This is why someone can describe with full accuracy that the substance no longer gives what it once gave, that the experience is disappointing relative to the craving. that the gap between anticipation and reality has been widening for months or years, and still find themselves moving toward it. The description is in the prefrontal cortex. The movement is in the dopamine system. They are not the same conversation. Schopenhauer called this the tyranny of the will, not conscious intention. Not rational goal setting, something prior to both, a blind, relentless striving that underlies all living things and expresses itself through human beings as desire, craving, and the pursuit of satisfaction that never permanently arrives. His framework had one central structural claim: the intellect is not in charge. The intellect is a tool. It evolved in service of the will, to help the organism find what it craves, to navigate obstacles, to justify what the deeper drive has already decided to do. The intellect doesn't lead, it follows. And when it's operating in service of a sufficiently powerful drive, it produces convincing-sounding reasons for whatever the drive has already decided. What made this philosophically radical in 1818 was the inversion it required. The Enlightenment assumption was that reason governed the passions, that the rational mind, properly applied, could evaluate desires and choose which to pursue. This was not a casual assumption. It was foundational to how Western philosophy had understood human agency for centuries. Kant had built an entire moral framework on the premise that rational beings could act from principle rather than from inclination. Schopenhauer reversed this entirely. Reason doesn't govern desire. Desire uses reason. The mind you believe is evaluating the situation is the same mind that has already been recruited to make the situation look a certain way. Applied to addiction, this generates a specific and verifiable prediction. The person in the grip of craving will not experience their reasoning as distorted. They will experience it as clear. The case for using will feel like a genuine assessment of the situation. The rationalization will arrive with the full texture of honest thinking, because the system producing it has no way to mark it as rationalization. It's reasoning. It just happens to be reasoning in service of a conclusion that was reached before the reasoning began. Berridge's research confirmed the mechanism underneath this. Dopamine-driven wanting isn't only triggered by the substance itself, it's triggered by cues. Environments, people, emotional states, sensory details associated with past use. The wanting system learns the entire context of reward, not just the reward itself. A person abstinent for months can experience acute craving triggered by a neighborhood, a song, a specific emotional state, without having consciously thought about the substance at all. The cue activates the wanting system before conscious awareness registers what's happening. By the time the person is aware of the craving, the motivational system has already been activated. The cognitive process that follows, the reasoning about whether to use, the weighing of consequences, the construction of justification, is happening downstream of a signal that has already been sent. The wanting arrives before the conscious thought. The rationalization follows. The sequence feels like deliberation. It isn't. Neuroscientist Nora Volkow, who directed the National Institute on Drug Abuse for 2 decades, described addiction as a disorder of the prefrontal cortex's ability to inhibit subcortical drives, specifically the failure of executive function to override sensitized dopamine circuits under conditions of craving. The prefrontal cortex is, roughly, the seat of the reasoning Schopenhauer called intellect. The subcortical dopamine circuits are, roughly, what he called will. Volkow's brain imaging research on people with active addiction showed reduced metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex compared to non-addicted controls. The region responsible for evaluating consequences, inhibiting impulses, and generating long-term planning was measurably less active. not absent, outcompeted. The implication is precise. The part of the brain that would produce the counter-argument to the craving is operating at reduced capacity in the exact moment the craving is at its most intense. The cognitive resource most needed for override is the one most compromised by the condition that requires overriding. What this explains clinically is why increasing the perceived consequences of use doesn't reliably produce behavior change in active addiction. If the prefrontal cortex were operating normally, clearer information about consequences would change the cost-benefit calculation. But the system doing the calculation is the one that's been compromised. You can't fix a hijacked reasoning system by giving it better information. This is also what makes the moral framing of addiction not just ineffective, but structurally wrong. The moral framing assumes the person is choosing, via a functioning deliberative system, to prioritize the substance. That recovery is therefore a matter of choosing differently, of applying the willpower they've failed to apply so far. The clinical picture shows that the deliberative system itself has been compromised. The prefrontal cortex that would produce the counter-argument to the craving is operating under conditions where the subcortical wanting system is generating enormous motivational pressure toward a single target. The rationalization that results isn't a free choice. It's the output of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, in service of the organism's dominant motivational state. Moral condemnation in this context is not just ineffective. It's addressed to the wrong system. It's a message delivered to the prefrontal cortex about values and consequences, in a situation where the prefrontal cortex has already been outcompeted by the circuitry it would need to override. The message arrives. It doesn't change the calculation. The wanting system was not consulted. Schopenhauer saw this 2 centuries before the imaging data. He thought confronting the will with logical arguments was futile, that the will would simply recruit the intellect to defeat the arguments. The interventions that work in clinical settings, medication-assisted treatment, behavioral therapy, environmental restructuring, don't work by strengthening willpower. They work by changing the conditions under which the wanting system operates. The approach that doesn't work reliably is the moral one. One more element Schopenhauer identified that clinical research has since confirmed. Change often begins not through argument or insight, but when competing motivational systems become stronger than the craving system. He believed the will loosened its grip not through intellectual confrontation, but through accumulated experience of suffering, severe enough to produce disillusionment with the pursuit itself. Not suffering as punishment. Suffering as the mechanism through which the organism eventually registers that the wanting system's object is no longer delivering enough to justify the cost it's extracting. The clinical picture is similar. What shifts the calculation isn't moral awakening. It's a threshold at which the competing motivational signals for connection, for health, for survival, for something the addiction has been displacing, become strong enough to begin redirecting the wanting system. This threshold is different for everyone. What makes it a threshold rather than a simple choice is that it involves a shift in the subcortical system, not just the prefrontal narrative about wanting to change. Understanding the damage doesn't produce that shift. People with addiction often understand the damage with precision. They can describe the consequences accurately, articulate the costs clearly, and still return to the substance because the wanting system has not registered the understanding as a reason to stop. The prefrontal knowledge and the subcortical motivation are operating in parallel, not in communication. What builds competing motivational systems is contact with what the addiction is displacing: sustained connection, meaningful activity, physical recovery, environments that train the wanting system toward other targets. This is why isolation reliably worsens addiction and connection reliably supports recovery. The wanting system is still there. The question is what it's being aimed at. Schopenhauer didn't have this mechanism. He thought the will could only be recognized, not redirected. The neuroscience is more precise. The wanting system is plastic. It learned the addiction. Under the right conditions, it can learn something else. Neuroplasticity research has documented something Schopenhauer's framework couldn't accommodate. The brain that was captured is not permanently that brain. Sustained abstinence produces measurable changes in prefrontal cortex activity. The inhibitory control that was overwhelmed during active addiction begins to recover. The dopamine system, removed from repeated activation by the substance, begins to recalibrate. The cue-triggered wanting that fired automatically and intensely in early abstinence gradually loses some of its force as the associations weaken without reinforcement. The process is slow, non-linear, and vulnerable to disruption, but the direction is real. Recovery isn't transcendence of a permanent condition. It's restructuring of a system that was temporarily captured. This is where the neuroscience extends beyond what Schopenhauer could see. He thought the will was essentially inescapable, that the most a person could achieve was a kind of recognition, a seeing through the drive, under conditions most people never reach. The clinical evidence is more specific and, in some ways, more useful. The wanting system can be changed. The rewiring that produced the addiction is the same kind of rewiring that recovery requires. The brain doesn't stay where it was. But on the core mechanism, on what addiction actually is, on why the intellect fails in the specific way it fails, on why insight doesn't automatically produce change, on why the person who clearly understands the cost of using continues to use, Schopenhauer's account and the neuroscientific account are describing the same structure from opposite ends of 2 centuries. The philosophical framework arrived first, built entirely from observation and reasoning, with no access to the neurological machinery it was describing. The neuroscientific framework arrived later, built from experiments and imaging data, and found the same functional architecture that the philosopher had mapped. 2 traditions, opposite methods, converging on the same dynamic. A motivational system that precedes reasoning, that recruits reasoning in its service, and that cannot be overridden simply by understanding what it is doing. He had no dopamine research, no brain scans, no clinical trials. What he had was a precise account of what happens when desire becomes powerful enough that reason stops leading and starts serving. Desire does not ask reason for permission. It recruits reason after the decision has already been made. He wrote that in 1818. The imaging data came later. The structure was already there. If you made it this far, thank you. That means a lot. And if this video gave you a different way of seeing how your mind works, consider subscribing. There's more coming, and it's built on the same standard as what you just watched. I'll see you in the next one.